everybody makes mistakes, and everybody gets embarrassed about those mistakes. A number of years ago, I had made a mistake at my job, and I ultimately owned up to it, but the person that had recognized my mistake decided to reach out to me about it, and that would have been fine, even though I felt embarrassed, except they decided to reach out to me and then go a little crazy with the CC on the email, and they emailed me and my direct supervisor and their supervisor and somebody else I worked with who had nothing to do with this whatsoever, and there ended up being about 4 or 5 people who weren't directly involved in it. Now, I would have certainly preferred that it just be me, but even if it was just my supervisor, that would be very appropriate. So the question is, why did this person email everyone? Was it to make sure that the mistake wouldn't happen again, or was it to get me in trouble? Now, I can't get inside the mind of somebody, but the perspective I have is that that person was just angry, and I validate their feelings, but ultimately there was nothing constructive that came from emailing all those other people. Whereas if they had reached out to just me and my direct supervisor, even though of course I would have felt bad, it really would have been for the sake of being constructive. And we're going to look at that idea of what do we do when we recognize something bad, something needs to be fixed, and we need to call people out on it. How do we do it in a constructive way? So in this week's Parashat Shelach, it's the famous story. It's considered one of the 2 greatest sins of the people in the Torah. The first one being the golden calf, the Egel HaZahav, and this one, which is often called the sin of the spies. But spies is not the best word. Hashem told Moshe, if you choose to, you can send a number of people to go check out the land of Canaan that will become the land of Israel. If everything went well, the understanding is that we would have moved into the land of Israel right away and not wandered for 40 years. Except those people that were sent in, the meraglim from the word regel, to walk, those scouts that were sent into the land, 10 of them came back and said, we can't conquer this land. It's going to devour us. We're grasshoppers in our eyes. We were small, tiny, and insignificant, and our enemies would see us as such as well. And then, of course, Caleb and Yehoshua said, no, we can absolutely do it. But it was too late. The meraglim, the scouts, who were really diplomats, they were political leaders of their tribes. They weren't military men for the most part. They had destroyed the morale of the people, and no one believed that it was time for them to conquer the land. Now, Hashem acted as though Hashem were very, very angry and, a great punishment against the people, but ultimately the greatest punishment or consequence was that the people had to wander in the land for 40 years. And now there's 2 ways to look at this. One is that the people didn't really sin. Rather, the majority of the meraglim, of the scouts, represented what all the people were probably feeling. They were afraid. They weren't ready for this. So it's not that God were punishing the people for punishment's sake. It's God recognized that the people needed a few generations of learning to survive on their own, not as slaves, learning how to be strong, learning how to be a military power, which under Yehoshua they really were. So there's no sin there, but we generally do consider what they did to be a sin. So what did they do that was so wrong? And it comes down to a single pasuk in this week's parsha, a single verse, which is, how did the meraglim tell the people about the land? And the Hebrew is, vayotzi'u dibat haaretz. Literally, and they brought out, out of their mouths came a dibat, or a dibah, on the land. So what is dibah? The simple understanding of dibah is slander. They slandered the land. And the way that the rabbis understand this, it's not that they went to Moshe and Aharon and, all of the meraglim and Yehoshua and sat down and said, we're very concerned. We saw some mighty nations. We're not sure. We know Hashem is with us, but we wanted to be honest about our fears. And Moshe and Aharon could sit down and say, here's what we're going to tell the people. Here's how we're going to prepare for it. No. Instead, they went out and they just told everybody the land is terrifying. It literally swallows up its inhabitants, and the people were terrified. But they weren't lying. They weren't lying. They were telling the truth. They were telling the same thing that they would have told Moshe and Aharon. So what did they do that was wrong? And there's an Israeli rabbi, Rabbi Avishai Taharani, and his drashot on the different parshiot, his sermons, he brings in an interesting source. It's the Talmud, the Masechet, the Tractate of Sanhedrin, and it's talking about how many witnesses one needs for certain cases. And the base is that for any testimony requires 2 witnesses. Nobody can be forced to be put to death or to pay anything general unless there's 2 witnesses. There are certain cases where 1 witness is enough. But then Rashi talks about a case where someone did a grave sin, idolatry, and it is absolutely not enough to convict them, life or death, on the voice of one person. One needs two witnesses. But what if one witness says, look, I know there's not a second witness, but I might as well tell you what I saw? And Rashi says that serves no purpose. And he actually, in his commentary, says, Motzi diba be'almahu. He says it's bringing out slander just for its own sake. What does he mean? How does Rabbi Taharani understand this? Is that if there's a case where the only way to convict the person and move forward in the case is to have two witnesses, and only one witness is there and he decides to talk anyway, there's no point in it. The case isn't going to go anywhere, so what does his testimony serve to do? To besmirch the name of that person, to claim, which may or may not be true, that that person is a sinner. If it's not true, it's certainly horrible, and if it is true, it doesn't matter. He's just wasting his words. So the point that Rabbi Taharani says about what the sin of the Meraglim is not that they told the truth, not that they were not giving testimony to what they really saw. It's that the way they told it to the people, there was nothing constructive about it. The only thing that came out about it is that the people were terrified and the morale was shot for decades to come. Had they perhaps gone to Moshe, they might have been able to think of a plan. And Hashem had said explicitly multiple times in the book of Shemot that if we have faith in Hashem, He will protect us in the land. But they forgot all about that, and they told everyone this in a non-constructive manner. So what we learn from this is that if we see something, a real problem, and it's real, and we know we have to say something, it's not enough to just say it. We have to think about who we're telling so that something can actually be done about it. But I want to conclude with one thought. In this case, it might have been enough to tell Moshe and Aharon. But I want to speak to what's going on today with the protesting and the issues with policing going all over the country. And one of the pushbacks, criticisms, is protesting isn't going to get anything done. Rather, people should go through the proper processes, tell the right people, write your senators. Now, all of that should continue to be done, but it's been done for generations, at least 40, 50 years, if not hundreds of years, depending on how one looks at it. People from the black community, the minority communities, even the Jewish communities, men like Rabbi Avram Joshua Heschel, people have been crying out in respectful ways for change to happen. And it's not happening. So perhaps what we're learning here is not that one has to only tell one or two people in the proper channels. One has to speak out in a way that will be constructive. And you can understand that word in many different ways. But for those who say the protests have accomplished nothing, that's not true. Multiple cities and states have already made major changes, whether it's defunding, disbanding, creating new policies, making certain actions like chokeholds illegal, and every single victory has great meaning. But the key here is that the people are not just yelling for the sake of protesting. It's hard to say there's one perfect way of protesting, but they're calling out because nothing was constructive before. And I really want to emphasize that. We need to speak up in a way that will be constructive. And it's hard. It's challenging to always know exactly what's going to work. So people don't need to sit down and spend months and weeks figuring out all the strategies. But just going out and burning a building down may or may not be constructive. But going out and marching and crying out against injustice, it's clear that that is working. And we should continue to do that. And that's not just now in the protest. In everything in life, we see injustice, not only on a global or national scale, but even in our own businesses, even our own jobs, even our own families. But we have to think to ourselves, if I'm going to tell someone about this, is it because I want to fix the problem? Or is it because I'm just trying, motzi diba ba'alma, I'm just trying to slander and hurt the other person? And again, it's a gray area. It's a gray area to know whether it's going to be constructive or not. But right now, we need to think about how can our voices be heard best. And it's clear that the protests are working to a great degree. Not all things will be resolved by it, but right now, this is the constructive way to speak out against injustice. With that, I wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom and be well.